Welcome. My name is Brahima Koulibaly. I'm the Vice President of the Global Economy and Development Program here at Brookings, and it's really a pleasure to welcome you for this event on breaking the cycle of poverty through innovative finance, taking lessons from a Village Enterprise Development Impact Bond. Here in Global, we're always looking for the next big idea to tackle the challenges of growth and development, particularly in Africa, where the development challenges are increasingly concentrated. So let me put a bit in a broader context the research agenda for today's event. I think the efforts by governments, philanthropies, multilaterals have really been successful in, partially at least, in lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. But despite this progress, there's some estimated 690 million people globally that still live in extreme poverty, and I think COVID has added to this headline number. By 2030, based on some work we've done at Brookings here by my colleague Homi Karas to track poverty rate in real time globally, by 2030, that number is going to decline, but only to 550 million people, which is obviously still far from the zero target under the Sdg Goal 1. Unless, of course, we act more forcefully and innovatively, I would say, because we can't do the same things we've been doing and expect the same outcome. I think crucial then to this poverty eradication effort and where we need to be innovative is the area of financing for development, because it's so crucial. And I usually like to say once you have a good development agenda, you don't have the financing for it, your plan is incomplete at best. You need to really have the solution, so how do you finance that agenda? So today's discussion is very timely because the financing constraints are particularly severe in this current environment, characterized by wider budget deficits, deteriorating sovereign debt outlooks, rising global interest rates, which is pushing up borrowing costs and also debt servicing costs. I was just chatting with Hanan here how this is somewhat of the perfect storm when it comes to financing for development for low-income countries, including those in Africa. As if that wasn't enough, we now have a Russia-Ukraine crisis that is causing unplanned increases in military expenditures, which is could have some consequences for overseas development assistance. So for nearly then I think this brings a bit into focus here, the importance of Emily's research. And for the past nearly decade, she and her team have really been thought leaders in the area of innovating financing for development, in particular on the topic of outcome-based financing. They have conducted in-depth research on social development impact bonds, which has resulted in numerous studies that have been referenced in top-tier media, including The Economist, The New York Times, The Financial Times, The Wall Street Journal. Her work has been widely recognized and used among policymakers, researchers, and academics alike, and has featured in forums such as the World Economic Forum and the UN General Assembly. The social development impact bonds combines elements of impact investing, result-based financing, and public-private partnerships, where private investors bring in upfront financing with repayment only if the innovation succeeds. And the Village Enterprise Development Impact Bond, which was launched in 2017, targeted first-time entrepreneurs living in extreme poverty in Kenya and Uganda. And it has demonstrated the strength of an outcome focus in ensuring sustainable impact and potential to unlock more diversified funding opportunities. I very much look forward to a fruitful discussion with a panel of experts on the possibilities of innovative financing to tackle the poverty-related challenges on the African continent and around the world. And importantly, too, on the strategies of how we scale up these type of innovations. Because we see micro-interventions that are successful, but then they stay at that level. So then I'll be curious to hear the views of the panel on this. So on that note, let me now introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Hanan Morsi, who is a Deputy Executive Secretary and Chief Economist at the UN Commission for Africa. And prior to the UNECA, she was Director of Macroeconomic Policy at the African Development Bank. And in that role, we collaborated with the African Development Bank when she was in charge of the research department. And she was also lead economist at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development and senior economist at the IMF. She's also visiting scholar at the Harvard Kennedy School, as Middle East Initiative. So following Morsi's remarks, Emily is going to moderate a panel discussion and then a fireside chat session with our colleague John MacArthur, who is a senior fellow and director of our Center for Sustainable Development. Before I turn it over to Dr. Morsi, on behalf of Brookings, I would like to extend our appreciation to the Delta Fund for its support to our Center for Universal Education. And I would also like to reiterate Brookings' commitment to quality, independence, and impact in all of its work. With that, I would like now to welcome Dr. Morsi to the stage. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. It's really great to be in person after so long of virtual meetings. So I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for the kind invitation on this very timely topic on breaking the cycle of poverty through innovative finance. What I will aim to do in my remarks is really provide the context and framing of our today's discussion, basically highlighting the financing needs and development needs for the continent, the challenges that the continent face and which have been aggravated by a series of shocks, and what it means for the way forward in terms of the need for innovative financing solutions and how today's event basically fit in. So let me start by the impact of COVID on the continent. So Africa's development and economic and social aspects have been really severely impacted by COVID pandemic. We've seen the continent suffer the worst recession in half a century in 2020 with contraction of 3%. And afterwards, there was a gradual kind of recovery, moderate recovery, but probably the worst impact of the pandemic have been really the reversal of very hard-won gains in poverty reduction in the continent. So it wiped 2 decades of very hard-won gains in reducing poverty. And to me, it's really, the worst part of that impact of the pandemic. And due to that, basically, we had the number of newly poor in Africa increased by 55 million. This is enormous. This is on top of everything that we had. And then we had also 39 million people that were pushed into extreme poverty. And in addition, we had between 30 to 35 million formal jobs that are at risk of reduction in wage and working hours because of reduced demand and enforced lockdown. We've seen fiscal deficits double on average for the continent. We've seen also debt accelerate rapidly, increasing from before the pandemic by about 10 to 15 percentage points of GDP, debt to GDP. And all this really, complicates an already challenging situation in terms of large development needs that the continent had even before the pandemic. Of course, the pandemic, in addition to poverty, also worsened inequalities, whether it's income inequalities or gender inequalities. So that also adds to the social pressures. As I mentioned, following the rebound in 2021, the growth was hoped and expected that it would continue to recover in 2022. However, at that time, there was also another challenge, which was the increasing rising inflation and tightening by global central banks, which means higher interest rate. That means it's higher cost of debt service for many of our countries, and hence made that recovery more challenging. But maybe let me, before we proceed more into what we're seeing now, just to give you a sense of the overall development financing gap that the continent needs. The SDG financing gap is estimated to have basically increased by $1.7 trillion. And for Africa, annual SDG expenditures are expecting to rise by $154 billion annually due to the pandemic. And by an additional $285 billion for the next 5 years to ensure adequate response to COVID. This comes on top of all the financing need that we had before the pandemic, and these include areas like infrastructure. And I remember vividly before presenting on this issue at Brookings in the African Economic Outlook, the infrastructure is estimated needs are between $130 to $170 billion annually. Health needs is estimated around $66 billion to address the needs and achieve SDG. Education, it's estimated to meet the SDG goals is basically annually $39 billion. And this is, in addition to this, there's also the climate mitigation and adaptation, which requires investments of over $3 trillion by 2030. So, we have all these needs. We have the needs that were even exacerbated by COVID. And then now, on top of it all, we are put in kind of the perfect storm, as I was talking to Brahima before. So while the continent was still recovering from COVID, basically we had the war in Ukraine, which have severe implications, economic and social implications for the continent. They are faced with 3 shocks: food, fuel, and finance. And basically, even though the links are modest in terms of overall trade, they are concentrated in products that really matter for poverty. They are concentrated in, basically food items, and they have led to global increase in global prices of these food items. And just to maybe give you a sense, the trade exposures for Russia and Ukraine in terms of importers, the largest 10 importers include Egypt, Ethiopia, Kenya, Libya, Morocco, Nigeria, Senegal, South Africa, Sudan, and Tunisia. So these are the top 10, and are the most affected. It's very important to remember that these constitute half of the population in Africa and 2/3 of GDP. So it's really significant what happens in these countries affect the rest of the continent. Also many of these countries are also the countries where pockets of poverty and those at risk of hunger are concentrated, even for ones that are considered as middle income. So that's very important to keep in mind. So let me perhaps just say that these striking figures call for significant and concerted efforts toward addressing a number of binding financing challenges. Of course, that include low levels of domestic resource mobilization, underdeveloped capital markets, limited access to finance and high cost of external private financing, and really lack of appropriate vehicles to channel climate financing. So here comes really the issue of what we're discussing today, that we really need new and innovative financing solutions to meet these enormous challenges. There are many areas that would help in that direction. The development impact bond is a good approach, which is not only just focus on the performance and result base, but also links private investors, the donors and beneficiary communities. The type of challenge that we're facing now requires really a multi-stakeholder collaboration to get to solutions that work. In addition, we have also, other things to think of. We have, there are, vast pension fund resources that can be actually leveraged toward development, and that's a huge potential. However, there are a number of issues that restrain that, including regulatory issues and regulatory limits, and the setup of these funds. Another thing, of course, is the issue of the need to unlock potential resources for things like impact investment, for issues of really having things like liquidity, sustainability facility. So I look very much forward to really listening to today's discussion and how it can fit within all the challenges that the continent faces. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Rahima, for welcoming us all here today, and to Hanan for your poignant keynote remarks. Your bird's eye view of the challenges and opportunities in the African continent certainly will provide a useful framing for our discussion today. Good morning to everyone here with us in Washington, D.C., and good morning and good afternoon and evening to those who are joining us online. It is such a pleasure, as the previous speakers have mentioned, to be here with you in person, those of you who are joining us in person after these 2 years. So today, as mentioned, we'll be discussing an innovative financing mechanism, one that's being used in over 200 projects across 38 continents around the world to tackle such issues as unemployment, poor education and health outcomes, welfare, criminal justice, and challenges in the environmental and agriculture sectors. So impact bonds, a form of outcomes-based financing, originated in the UK in 2010 as a way to address inefficient public spending on remedial interventions, initially including prison recidivism and quickly spreading to include the other social challenges that I mentioned. The premise behind this mechanism was that it would be a triple win for government, private sector, and the recipients of social services by bringing risk capital to promising social interventions and tying public expenditures to the achievement of agreed upon outcomes, in addition to the potential for return for investors. We often describe impact bonds as a combination of a public-private partnership, or PPP, results-based financing, and impact investing, as Brahima mentioned. We've also described them as a new type of PPP, partnership for public purpose, or a model of partnership that brings together a diversity of stakeholders to achieve social good. In the case of social impact bonds, or SIBs, this includes governments as outcome funders. And in the case of development impact bonds, or DIBs, this includes third parties such as foundations, bilateral and multilateral agencies such as USAID, the World Bank, FCDO, and UN agencies. Today in our panel, we have the opportunity to hone in on a development impact bond for poverty alleviation in Kenya and Uganda. It is, in fact, the only impact bond in the world that has focused directly on this issue. And it is one of 7 impact bonds in sub-Saharan Africa, and one of 22 to have been contracted in low and middle income countries. So with that background, I would now like to welcome our speakers to the stage to dive deeper into this topic. So, with me on stage, we have Brian Voland, who is the co-founder of the Delta Fund, which is a portfolio of impact investments and grants focused on supporting organizations working to improve equity. And Tadeo Murayuki is Vice President for African Operations at Village Enterprise, which is a nonprofit organization focused on the elimination of extreme poverty. Joining us online are Avnish Gungadurdos, who is the co-founder and managing partner of Instiglio, a nonprofit advisory firm dedicated to pioneering results-based financing approaches in international development. And Ruth Levine is the CEO of ID Insight, a mission-driven global advisory, data analytics, and research organization that helps global development leaders maximize their social impact. You can find more details on their illustrious backgrounds in the agenda, those of you who are here in person, which is also available online. So, Avnish, let's start with you. At Instiglio, you've been involved in helping to design and manage many projects around the world using outcomes-based financing. Could you kick us off by describing the Village Enterprise DIB and the rationale behind its origin?
Great. Well, can you hear me, Emily?
Yes.
Perfect. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for, first of all, hosting this event and for having us. We just maybe by just describing the project, and then I'll get into the rationale. So this project sort of brings together 3 different funders, FCDO, USAID, and a philanthropic organization based out of New York, who mobilized together about $5.2 million of outcomes funding. And we went out to write this outcomes contract with Village Enterprise as the implementing organization. And that was actually done through an outcomes fund structure where the donors put their funds in this trust fund, which was managed by the Global Development Incubator. And this was really done in large part to really streamline donor engagement in these processes, to make it as easy as possible for Village Enterprise as well to interface with the donors, so that they would ultimately have a single contract, which was backed by these donors, that basically, specified only 3 things. What are the outcomes that the donors are after? And these were basically improvements in income for the 12,000 ultra-poor households that Village Enterprise was going to work with. And second, what was the methodology to evaluate those outcomes? And that was an RCT that ID Insight executed. And thirdly, how much were we going to pay for each unit of improvement in income that we were able to observe at the end of the program, which was also specified. So it was a really kind of a big effort to streamline and to simplify outcomes contract. And you'll also notice that a very conscious decision, which had pros and cons, I think, and there's tons of learning that we can talk about later in the conversation, was to really kind of delegate the task and the challenge of raising capital to Village Enterprise. We wanted to really simplify the donors' engagement as much as possible. So far, we believe that donors, outcome funders being at the table has been the single biggest constraint to growing this practice. So finding ways to simplify that was a big focus for the project. So that was a little bit what the Impact 1 was about. Outcome funders signing an outcomes contract with Village Enterprise, and Village Enterprise then on the back of that contract going and raising working capital and mobilizing its program to deliver outcomes, ID inside evaluated, and then outcomes payments were made at the end. So now very quickly why we decided to do this project. This thinking really started around 2016, 2017. Right around that time, there was a really sort of popular, famous study that was published in a science journal that was studying this class of interventions that's called the Poverty Graduation Program. That's the program that Village Enterprise implements, which accompanies ultra-poor families and helps coaches them to develop small businesses and find ways to generate new income streams. And this was kind of very much thought of as best-in-class intervention, one of the most cost-effective ways of addressing extreme poverty. And this study did something quite interesting, which is to study the effect of these programs in 7 different countries. And we saw incredible variation of performance. In India, the cost benefit was around 432%. In Honduras, it was minus 200%. So even when policy and programs are extremely evidence-based and evidence-informed rather, you see incredible variation in performance and impact. And that's very representative, I would say, of the broader development programming in different sectors. So we set out to really find a way, and when we kind of really look at why that's the case, quickly you hear from implementers that implementation matters a whole lot. It's not just about the design of program. Context matters, and you really need to be able to problem solve when you're working in volatile contexts with ultra-poor families in ways that traditional finance and contracting that's activity-based, that's very rigid, doesn't really allow for. So it was really real technical impetus to design this kind of program where the financing would be exclusively tied on outcomes, where we would be able, by virtue of that, help donors not really tie Village Enterprise down to a predefined activity plan, but rather give them the autonomy to go and really figure out how to work with different types of households and how to deliver and tailor services to them. And we wanted to see if that actually helped boost the effectiveness of the program and also give guarantees of impact to donors that they would only pay on outcomes and somehow provide a way to make programming much more effective and to really increase the overall effectiveness of public spending. And the second real big rationale was to really, at that point in time, we had seen more or less foundations being involved in impact bonds. We wanted to really see a leap to the bigger development agencies participating in this. So carving out a project where they could really test and experience pure form results-based finance and start really, appreciate how to design these instruments and how to evaluate them and what kind of effect it can have on both in terms of the outcomes, but also in the qualitative aspects of implementation was really kind of for us an entry point to larger change management within development finance and how it's being spent and the effectiveness of it.
Okay, fantastic, Avnish, thank you. So Avnish started to share a little bit about Village Enterprise. So tell us more about the poverty alleviation model and why do you think that this model was a good fit for a DIB, and why is Village Enterprise a good fit for a DIB, Tadeo?
All right, thank you. First of all, thank you for having me here. It's been really good to be in person. We're so used to having the virtual thing, so just having people here, it's really a really good thing. Yeah, so Village Enterprise, we implement what we call a one-year ultra-poor graduation model, where we really work with people who are living in extreme poverty, supporting them to start businesses so that they can be able to increase their incomes and also their assets. So we really, again, really work with people who we find isolated, who live in the margins of society, people who left out sort of even
government programs or even market programs. So we really thought, having us being an organization that has really worked in this space, we had rigorous evidence based on, in terms of the work, we were very confident that implementing a development impact bond would be a really nice pilot for us. Just thinking about, we want moving our team to thinking about the end user rather than activity based, as what Avnish has said. That's the kind of, we're trying to have that transformation to think about how do we have an approach that really focuses on that end user, that person who we are really supporting to start these enterprises and
able to tailor to their needs.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So for us, thinking of, why was it a good fit? We have a cost-effective approach. We have an approach that we're able to contextualize in different places. For this DIB, we were actually able to implement it in different countries. So we really wanted to see, is this an approach that we could be able to use? So in future, we're able to unlock. As a couple of people have mentioned here, one of the constraints is we have all these micro interventions that are not able to scale. So really trying an innovative approach that if we show robust results, we could be able to advocate for scaling.
To be able to demonstrate.
Yes.
Yeah, great, fantastic. All right, Brian.
Yeah.
So back when this DIB was being developed, impact bonds were a fairly new financing mechanism, and in fact, there were only a couple of contracted impact bonds in developing countries, and I'm sure. So, as an investor, I'm sure there are investors in the audience who would love to hear, why did you become interested in this, and how did you get involved, and what was in it for you?
So let's talk about money.
All right, let's talk about money.
So, all right, you guys know this probably. So, how much in assets sit in U.S. foundations? Does anyone know? 500 million? Higher or lower? What do you guys think? Higher. Getting some hires. So, in 2020, there was $1.2 trillion with a T sitting in U.S. foundations. And that means it's invested, I love Coca-Cola. Coke's great, I like to drink it, but it's invested in Coke. It's invested in real estate. It's invested in these other things. The largest charity in the United States is, anyone know? Fidelity. Their DAF, their Donor Advised Fund, is the largest charity in the United States. These funds are sitting on the sidelines. They're not actually helping with development. And so we started to look at our assets, both personally and in our Donor Advised Fund, and tried to say, we need to make a change and align all of our assets towards impact and towards our values. It's like, no problem, this will be easy. I'll talk to somebody, we'll shift everything towards actually changing the world and having impact, and it was incredibly hard. So we're not finding vehicles to do so. So we started to look at this development impact bond as an opportunity to bring money in off of the sidelines for us as a proof of concept, and then to try to get people who are asset holders to think about what they could do to invest their capital in ways that can take on risk that governments tend to not take on, and start to have real returns that are beyond financial returns, right? So one of the things that I'm particularly passionate about is ROI is not just the dollars on the sheet. ROI should be the impacts and the benefits we get societally. So we saw this as a mechanism to develop a proof of concept to show that you could bring risk acceptable capital into a situation where you could actually help an intervention scale, right? So, we had known Village Enterprise for a while. We knew this was a proven model. It should be growing. So it became an opportunity to prove that and to start to scale that. So, if you can start to demonstrate to foundations that they can bring capital to bear in ways that then governments can support scaling even more or reimbursing to put it back out into risky places, then you can go after family offices. So family offices are the offices of the ultra-wealthy who not only do they have more, they have $5.6 trillion in assets that could be deployed in ways that really bring benefits to communities who need it. That for us was the motivator, right? Is looking at interventions that you can prove work. I mean, the thing about this is we knew beforehand that Village Enterprise worked. We know even more now that it works. So we should bring as much capital to bear to these solutions as possible. That was our motivator, and I think that was why we're excited about that trend.
Great. And I'm sure we'll get to hear more about what's next and
Sure.
your encouragement of others to engage. So Ruth, so ID Insight had the tough job of doing a high stakes evaluation in the middle of the COVID pandemic. So, first of all, how did you do this evaluation at ID Insight, and what did you find? We get to hear exciting results.
Yeah, thanks, Emily. Can you hear me well?
Yes. Yes, we hear you.
Okay, great. Greetings from very toasty New Delhi. So it was indeed a very challenging evaluation, and we had to kind of pivot our data collection plans and schedule because COVID hit more or less right in the middle. And so we had to take a number of measures to protect the health and safety of both the respondents to the survey data collection and to our survey team itself. And I'll talk a little bit about that later, but let me get to the kind of evaluation design and what we found. So the goal of our evaluation was to measure the attributable impact of the Village Enterprise program on the economic welfare of households. Did it make a difference to households in extreme poverty? And if so, how much? And as you heard earlier, these were households in Western Kenya and Eastern Uganda. So to do this, we conducted a randomized controlled trial, an RCT, to measure that impact of the program that was financed by the DIB, and that was run in 241 villages from 2017 to 2020, so quite a span of time. And it involved about 15,000 of the poorest households. So originally, we had planned a kind of phased end-line survey, but because of COVID, we conducted one end-line survey of about 10,000, close to 10,000 households from May to August 2021. And that was, depending on when the households participated in the program, that was somewhere between 6 months for some households up to 2.5 years for other households from the point where they ended their participation in the program. And so our results show the results on households over that duration. So we looked at basically many things, but two high-level endpoints or types of impact. One is consumption, and the other is assets. So on average, we found that the monthly consumption was about $10 higher in the households that participated in the program compared to those who didn't. So that's $10 a month greater, and that's about 6% higher consumption levels. So what did this mean for households? It meant that they were able to purchase and consume more food, and that was especially, it turned out, staple foods and meats. As I said, we also looked at assets, and on average, the households that had participated in the program had about $40 more in assets than the households that didn't participate. And again, that's about a 6% difference. And so the households that had participated, we saw buying more durable assets and livestock, as well as additional inventory for businesses. And just to sort of emphasize that some of these households had kind of ended their participation in the program up to 2.5 years before we did the end-line survey. And so I think that suggests that they were pretty persistent effects of the program, which is exciting to see. And this was obviously during the acute period, at least that sort of second half of the time when the program was implemented was during a pretty acute pandemic period. So let me just say a couple of words about what the team, and it was kind of an incredibly talented and dedicated team at ID Insight that did this work. It was one of the first projects that we did when we were able to go kind of back to field work after closing that down during the most acute COVID period. And so what the team did and what we did as an organization to protect the health and safety of all the participants and all of our colleagues was incorporate very robust COVID safety protocols, lots of use of PPE. Our team wore the masks and passed out masks that were worn. And we also had to take into consideration what we would do if one or more of the surveyors or any member of our team became ill or even tested positive. And so we had to take into consideration, where are we going to quarantine? How are we going to protect others on the team as well as survey respondents? So I'm belaboring this point just a little bit because I want to emphasize how challenging this evaluation was and honestly how proud I am of the team for having been able to do it. And I'm also grateful to FCDO and the other outcome payers who came together and were able to support the extra costs associated with the precautions we took.
That's great. Thanks so much, Ruth. I know that there's so much more behind this, and I wish we had time to dig deeper into it. With wearing my evaluation hat, I wish I could hear more. I know there were also some heterogeneous impacts, and if anybody's interested in reading more details about the evaluation, that can be found on the ID Insight website. So Tadeo, back to you. So as a service provider, tell us a little bit about how being involved in this development impact bond has been different than sort of your business as usual. So normally, I assume you receive grants that are based on some activities. How has this been different?
Yeah, that's a really good question. First of all, I just want to emphasize the results from what Ruth has said, and seeing that we had such positive results during a pandemic. So we are really convinced that we're in for a pandemic, our results would have been more exponential than that.
Absolutely, yeah.
So for us to get to those results, it really, we just contrast it to the kind of traditional funding we do. Just before I came here, I was checking my emails, and I had this email telling me urgent, burn rate, very low burn rate. Right? So burn rate is what some of our funders really insist, like we need to be spending money, because to spend money, that means it shows that we are doing activities. So that's what happens is in such of types of traditional funding, we're going to be pulling our teams now to be able to pour through spreadsheets to make sure that they're doing timesheets, trying to allocate costs and all that. But how much better would it be if we're really focusing on the outcomes, really focusing on that entrepreneur, looking through the data and saying, how can we be able to support that entrepreneur to be able to get increased income? Yeah. So traditional funding, I feel like it's broken. I think we should do a better job of fixing it. And I think having such an innovative approach would really be able to be one of the solutions where we're really able to have programs really focusing on the end user, on the outcomes, rather than just the multiple, all the activities that we really have to do. I mean, it's not a bad thing. We need the money, so we have to kind of, they say who pays the piper calls the tune, so we have to do these things. But for us, having that kind of shift where we were able to just really be flexible, to be able to do, our own things without really thinking behind the back, do we have to have reporting on it, do we have to stop doing this, but just focusing on how am I able to support that person, increase their income, increase their savings, how do you increase their business profitability. That was really, really phenomenal. And we really enjoyed it because we had that freedom, you could breathe and just do as much as you can without really thinking, how am I going to be reporting on these donor requirements? But that end user being the person who we are really targeting.
And did this mean that along the way you had to be collecting, kind of more real-time data to figure out sort of, kind of who's doing well, who's doing less well, who do we need to focus on?
You've nailed it. You've nailed it. So what we really did is actually we improved our performance systems. Mm-hmm. So we started calling it an adaptive management system. Mm-hmm. We even accelerated some of the systems that we had already always been thinking about doing. So we gave access to all our field teams. So we provided them with tablets. They had access to dashboards, and these are things that we always knew at the back of our minds that we needed to do. Right. But just because we really needed to make sure that that person who's supporting has data to be able to guide them in making that decision. So let's say we had like some dashboards where they could look and say, oh, the business is a red business. So they're able to go to the dashboard, to the business and say, oh, this is person, the reason they're struggling. Maybe they're not keeping their records, or maybe they're having problems accessing inputs, which is really affecting their business. So that just having the access to that data and then making targeted interventions based on that data was really transformational for us.
I can imagine. Yeah, that sounds fantastic. So Avnish, let's come back to you. So just taking a little bit of a step up, what do you see as the opportunities for outcomes-based financing for poverty alleviation in general, and also just for development, and more broadly for development finance? Let's start with that.
Yeah, thanks for that. So maybe to answer this question, just it's good to really sort of agree on what it is that we're trying to scale, right? And I often think about a set of best practices and an expertise that we are really developing for these projects with our partners, with the broader ecosystem, around how to really get delivery to be high quality and implementation to be ultimately driven by beneficiary outcomes and to be ultimately improving and impacting lives. So we're learning things like what are the most effective ways of structuring finance, what are ways of baking performance incentives in financing, what are ways to measure efficiently, what are ways to performance manage. So all in all, this is starting to contribute to an emerging science around delivery financing and delivery management. It's testing various innovations in how to do this. And with each of the projects and impact bonds and results-based finance projects we've seen in the last 10 years, we've started to really build a bit of an evidence base, a bit of a sort of toolkit of what works and what doesn't. And certainly the journey is still young and there's lots to learn. But the question around opportunities to grow this is really a question about where should we be integrating this kind of practices more. And for one big opportunity that I've been advocating for, and I think we've been advocating for as an organization, is to really turn our attention to how do we integrate these practices of results-based financing and performance management, in the large-scale procurement systems of governments, for example, or in government delivery systems, or in aid institutions, large-scale delivery systems. Today, we're talking about north of $5 trillion being spent in delivery systems that are not really delivering results as consistently, as often, and at the levels that we would want them to. Right. So when we often talk about the development financing gap, I think a first order question is to make sure that we are using the money that we already have really well and really efficiently. So we need to be finding ways to bake those practices and mainstream those practices, certainly in simpler ways and simpler instruments, in ways that are scalable. But I would think it would be a worthwhile pursuit for donors and philanthropy to really dedicate significantly more resources and attention to fixing our delivery systems around the world. We've seen what happens in COVID when that's not taken care of. Governments are not able to actually react to the increasingly complex priorities that they have to be delivering on for citizens. And I think that we're starting for these projects to really lay the foundation for this kind of work to translate at larger scale. And certainly in the last few years, we've already been engaging government in these multi-year delivery reforms, starting to generate evidence of how this can work in more politicized environments. And that's really where the big opportunity, I think, for this work is, and where we should really be taking the work forward.
Absolutely. Thanks, Avnish. And Ruth, you have, before your role at ID Insight, you have quite a bit of experience kind of on the funder side. So what do you think that funders and others might keep in mind if as they consider joining, whether they want to be part of a development or social impact bond or other results-based financing mechanism? Ruth, can you hear me? Did we lose you? Well, while we're getting you back, I'll jump to Brian. Can you hear me, Ruth? No. Okay. All right. We'll jump to Brian in the meantime. We've heard a little bit. You made very clear what your views as an investor. But what do you have to say about some of the criticisms of impact bonds? So the high design costs, or this idea that investors are making money off the backs of the poor?
Ooh, you went there. You really went there. So I think there's a couple things to think about here, right? So let's look in isolation, and then let's look broadly at the sector. So if you look at this development impact bond specifically, the impact is forecast to be 4x over the duration of the next couple of decades. Can't remember the length of time, but the moving forward impact is 4x the cost of the program, right? So there's a durable, sustainable, significant impact that comes just from the cost of the program. So I think that's one thing to think about. The second thing to think about is how you would think about a single DIB in isolation versus hopefully a portfolio of them, right? Ideally, what I talked about earlier with risk acceptable capital being able to fund interventions that are not proven, that's kind of where I'd like to see the space go. The criticism that I would accept from this DIB on the investor payouts is that I didn't take a lot of risk. Because we knew Village Enterprise, we had seen an RCT on their interventions and results. We knew that it worked. It was highly likely that as they scaled, they would work more. So it would be on the lower risk end of a kind of investment. Should we do tons of those? No, absolutely not. We should have, before that, actually just funded Village Enterprise with a lot of money because we actually knew, we did, but like other people as well, governments and agencies with unrestricted funding. So one of the benefits we talked about earlier is that a lot of funding gets restricted and you chase burn rate, which I get nauseous when I hear chasing burn rate. We should fund the organizations that work, we should fund the interventions that work, we should fund them well, and we shouldn't be restrictive in the kinds of funding that we give them. Some of these finance structures can create that, right? Where you take organizations that tend to put restrictions on things and you remove those restrictions. Ideally, you'd have a portfolio where some of these interventions should fail. Right? We should have development impact bonds where the results don't turn out what you think they are, what you want them to be. Because that means that you're taking risk, you're innovating in the space, and then you are able to take those learnings and apply them, or have other development impact bonds that are successful. Create a portfolio that maximizes impact. And then one last thing. If you do a development impact bond like this, right? We have this incredible RCT that was done. Super expensive. Would you do it on everything? No. Does it give you an incredibly high signal on impact and changes to the program and the interventions it had? Yes. Will Village Enterprise change how they work moving forward? Yes. That has an impact that's not calculated in the benefits of the development impact bond. Will they be able to scale their programs more effectively because they can now attract more and more capital? I believe so. And so then, this high investment on a learning phase, on an innovation phase, and a proof phase, then has scaling implications beyond that phase, I fully believe. So that's kind of the important part to me. So one, a portfolio where some of these should work, some of these should not work. We should have risk capital pushing interventions that we want to prove, and then we should scale them. The thing that I'm super keen on is USAID and FCDO coming out of this. They should have no questions about what to fund in the future, right? This should just be on their line item every year. We know that graduation works and Village Enterprise works. So here you go. Every year we're now scaling this program, right? And then you start to see the benefits of those upfront costs prove out a model that scales interventions that has real impacts for people, not burn rate, but human lives changed. So that's kind of the feelings I have. And Some of the pushback comes from foundation leaders who give out less than 5% a year, so that's a whole separate gripe I've got.
Right. Great. I'm going to move on to our rapid fire questions. Ruth, can you hear me now? No. All right. So we're going to jump into my final question to all of the panelists. So what I wonder is, what's next? Either for your organization or for outcomes-based financing or development finance more broadly. Let's start with you today.
I just want to hang out with Brian. I mean, he's going to unlock all that, the passion he exhibits. Yes, we are very excited. We saw the results. We have also seen internally what kind of mindset shift that, having the data-centric framework. So for us, really thinking about how do we scale this up? Because really, a lot of it is, I think there are two things. We need to change from being an activity-centric to an outcome-centric. Some time back, I was listening to a donor who I don't want to mention, but they mentioned that they've poured billions of dollars in a certain region in Kenya, but anytime they come there, they lament that they've seen hardly anything. So I'm thinking if they had this sort of predefined outcome metrics working with all these different organizations or service providers, I bet you they probably would have seen something, of course, allowing some latitude of failure. So I think moving from that sort of activity, not how many workshops, how many trainings, how that, but what are you doing for that person on the ground? The other thing is unlocking capital, scaling it up. How do we, I think both of speakers initially, they said, in terms of the magnitude of poverty and being exacerbated by the pandemic, the need is so great. We have to find a funding that really is able to reach more people, and not only in the poverty alleviation space, but also in others. So for us, Village Enterprise, really what's next is working with governments, trying to see how governments are going to be able to adopt this, so that we can be able to reach more people, and also support other implementers who are really interested in this space and how we can be able to share our lessons with them.
That's fantastic. I really think that's a really great last point, I think, and I've seen that with other service providers. I'm sure you're getting a lot of calls from other service providers around the world who say, how did you do this? So I think the investors also should support their time to be able to do that. Ruth, can you hear me?
I can. Thank you so much for teaching Mike. I'm really sorry I couldn't hear you before.
Yeah, no problem. So the question is, we've jumped into what's next, and perhaps you can bring into some of your perspectives. As I said, having been wearing the funder hat in the past, kind of what should funders be thinking of next?
Yeah, thanks for the question. And again, sorry, I couldn't hear the earlier ones. Well, I think the primary consideration for funders who are considering this kind of way to drive impact is the primary consideration is to kind of know thyself. It's a very special kind of funder that I think can really appreciate and engage in this kind of innovative financing, hopefully an increasing number of funders and types. But it's really important that funders understand that it requires an ability to negotiate, compromise, and then pull your hands away. And not all funders are constitutionally built to do that, from my experience. And particularly the important act of, as I say, pulling your hands away. And what that means is giving full discretion to the program implementers to be creative, to innovate, to figure out more efficient ways to do the work, and for the funder not to micromanage, or frankly not to manage at all. So again, funders need to understand, am I that kind of funder that is able to do that? Or could I become, and what would have to change in my incentive environment to permit that to happen?
Great.
I also think that funders should think about and try to figure out whether this sort of arrangement, any kind of results-based funding, and particularly a development impact bond, is likely to lead to better ultimate outcomes than the standard way of doing business. And I think there is a persuasive case to make, but it's always important to sort of do the comparison, right, between business as usual and a new kind of model. So if a funder primarily is a project funder, the question is, can this lead to greater innovation and outcomes alignment than their business as usual? And again, I think there's a case to be made that in many instances, it will lead to better outcomes alignment. And if a funder is provides unrestricted funding, so is already kind of hands-off and creates the environment for innovation and efficiency gains among, with a grantee organization, then I think the question is, if you're asking, is it going to be better than the way I normally do business? I think the question is it going to attract and bring in other funders? Is my participation going to grow the pie? So if I still wear my funder hat, those are the kinds of considerations I would be thinking about. What kind of funder am I? And what is the gain from engaging in this kind of arrangement relative to business as usual?
Thanks so much, Ruth. I really love that. What kind of funder am I? Comment. I think that really makes sense. So, Avnish and Brian, each of you have one minute. We want to make sure we have time for audience questions. So, Avnish, I'm going to ask you this: what's next question? And if you can do that in 1 minute, that would be great. I know it's a hard task.
Thank you, Emily. Very challenging task for me, who's not at all concise, but I'll try. So what's next for us? I think I alluded to that in the last response I gave, is to really find ways to integrate those practices in governments who are today the scale funders and the scale doers in most countries where we work. So we're going to be looking at really increasing our government partnerships, finding ways to engage champions where we find them, windows of opportunity where we find them, to test and try results-based financing and performance management practices within the platform of government, whether that's for procurement or direct delivery systems. I think that's a real vacuum that the space needs to really focus a lot more on. We're going to try to generate evidence that's currently thin in the space on what kind of deltas in impact we can generate and governments can generate by adopting these practices at scale. And with some of these biggest scale partners like the World Bank, the EU, the Global Fund, we're currently working with them to bring those practices to many different countries, to really find ways to expose more governments to this and really scale up these practices. I think today it's unacceptable that governments don't have the right systems to manage the impact bottom line. They manage way too much money for that, and I think we need to find ways to really upgrade our governments across the board to do better on the public money and to really evolve public financial management from just being a system of tracking spending to being a system of tracking social value that governments add to their countries. So that's really what we are hoping to aim for. We've really an ambition to change standards and change the standards of what we find acceptable when it comes to public financial management.
Right, it's really a mindset shift, and particularly among the big players and government, obviously, who is holding so much of the funding. All right, Brian.
Unrestricted funding. We're 100% unrestricted funder. We need more people to get there, and I would argue everyone should get there too. We should scale this flavor of graduation models. The implementation that Village Enterprise did crazy works, so we should all grow it. And then 3, there was a lot that we learned about this development impact bond. There's a bunch of structural stuff I would do differently. In the future, like we think that results-based funding broadly has a ton of promise, so we're going to continue to test different models, tons of interesting financing models that are coming into play. We're going to continue to work on those.
Great, thank you.
Less than 60 seconds.
Fantastic. All right, so I'd like to now open it up to the audience for some Q&A. And so we have somebody that has a microphone. They're standing in the back. So raise your hand if you have a question. You're finally in person. You can do this in person. Ibrahima has a...
Thank you for really interesting insights on this. I have a couple of questions. I think one's for you, Tadeo. I think you touched on it a little bit, but if you can clarify more whether the design feature itself of that impact bond is an incentive in itself that have direct impact on the outcome, as opposed to, say, any kind of other funding. Are you seeing evidence that because of that repayment incentive, you're getting better outcomes on those compared to other type of funding? And then for Brian, in the grand scheme of things, I'm trying to get a mental picture here of how big can this get? You shared some numbers, like, over $1 trillion in assets. So if ideally everything, all constraints removed, how big can it get? And should it even get that big?
Let's collect a couple questions. Tamara?
Well, thank you very much for this. It was very interesting. I guess I'm left with bridging the trillions of dollars that Hanan talked about with the $4 million investment that this project represents. So, we spent a lot of time talking about scale, but how do you get there is clearly the big question, and many of you addressed that question. What really is the binding constraint? Is it lack of bankable projects? Is it not enough donors with the right mindset? Is it quality of implementing partners on the ground? Is it management information systems? Is it all of the above? And I like the direction that Avnish pointed to in terms of working with governments to reform their systems as probably the most likely route to scale. So it's a combination of comment and question.
Great. There's one more question there, and then we'll go to answer.
Great, thank you. Just two quick ones. One is the deployment of philanthropic capital into impact bond structures. How much of it is through program-related investments or PRIs? The second question, unrelated, but in looking at the outcome-driven focus and results focus of this, how much do you see or mitigate against gaming the system to the outcomes? Thank you.
All right, great. Thanks. So Tadeo, do you want to take that first
sure.
question?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. So so let me just go back. When we started the impact bond, what we did is we really sat down with the whole team just to explain to them the structure and why we were doing this. And then now for them to kind of now move into that, what Emily said, mindset shift, that we're really going to be working towards outcomes that are going to translate for payments. Because for us, it was, first of all, we need to get paid, but also a reputational risk. If we don't deliver this, then what else? Even our traditional funders will probably dry. So yes, the design did lend to the focus on outcomes. So one thing, that's why we accelerated innovations. We said, whatever we need to do to get these outcomes, let's do it. And so we were able to take calculated risks. Before, we used to have so many other meetings before you make a decision, but now we're like, you try this out. And we can also democratize it so even our field team, if they come up with an idea, they want to try it out with business groups, would let them do that. Use the use of data to make sure that everything that we did was informed by data, but looking at the end goal, like how does that translate into that outcome? But really make sure that it's increasing the impact of our entrepreneurs. So yes, the design did really help us, incentivize us in terms of making sure that we're achieving the outcomes.
I really love this idea that your field teams are getting to come up with ideas and innovate on their own, and that's so fantastic. So Brian, how big can this get? Was one question. Yeah.
Yeah, I wish I had a number, but massive, right? So if we're just talking about trillions on the sidelines in foundations and family offices, you have other trends where you have millennials who are, when you survey them, they say they actually want to invest their money in things that do good in the world and they're actually willing to sacrifice return, right? So it's not just about extractive capitalism for the next generation, it's about holistic returns. And I think that's the part of a system shift that we're seeing. You're seeing a lot of energy that's been captured in impact investing and ESG, which is 95%, in my opinion, baloney and marketing, but it's capturing a consumer demand of we want to have impact. So I think the shift that I expect to see is that we'll start to get systems change that create the ability for people to start to see what their impact was alongside their financial impact. There's a lot of stuff that has to happen there. You have to have your financial systems report on other metrics than did your portfolio dollars go up or down? And connect people closer to the work. That stuff's starting to happen. There's pockets of that, but that starts to unlock, I think, more and more of this capital that can be deployed in pools, like a collective fund of your average person being able to invest in some of these interventions would be a really exciting intervention in the future. It's going to take a long time to get there because we have an American capitalist gospel of shareholder returns is the most important thing. And that's the system that is starting to get pressure and starting to change. So wish I knew the size. I do think it's potentially massive. And I do feel like people want more than just the dollars. But I'm also an optimist, but people are saying that too.
So there's actually an impact bond in Israel that used crowdfunding.
Oh, I want to know about that.
Yeah, super interesting. So it sounds kind of like if you build it, they will come.
I think I'm a big believer that you can shape consumer perceptions and demands. It's harder, easier to capture existing consumer interests. And there's this groundswell, particularly in the millennials. I think older generations are going to be harder to change the mentality there. I think the millennials, et cetera, are moving in that direction, having conversations with people who run family offices, who are generational wealth kind of folks, who are saying, we have to do more with these assets. It's not just about growing the number to be 3-5x by the time we move on, but how do we actually deploy capital in ways that matters? So it's happening. It's just not off the shelf. It's not the first selection in your Schwab portfolio. It's, those types of changes.
But I think if the if you build it piece is perhaps what Tamara was getting to, right? So we need to have the outcome funding side of it, right? Avnish or Ruth, do you want to take the question or around scale? I know you've touched on that a bit, but what are the kind of, if you could say 3 key things that need to happen to get this to scale, what are they?
Yeah, happy to take a crack. I wish it were that simple. But I think sort of the unfortunate reality is that our funding and programming systems are just so insufficiently accountable to the people we serve. These people are not in the boardroom. They're often the people with the lowest voice in the entire system. The dynamics of the front lines are absolutely lopsided. So there's absolutely no accountability regarding service delivery and service quality. And we really hugely rely on the goodwill of individuals in public institutions and at the front lines to do well. And the institutions within which they work are not, I think, oftentimes systematically incentivizing a focus on service delivery quality and impact. So I think, the first starting point for success in this work, I think, is to really even appreciate just how huge of a change management this is to shift a system, an international aid system or public sector systems that are so comfortably locked into a low performance equilibrium, and how hard that transition is going to be for everybody. It's hard to perform better. It's hard to perform differently. You need to be comfortable with having less reach with greater impact. This is a huge political transition. So we're at the intersection of, very complex and thorny political issues, very complex and thorny delivery issues. And I think, we need to be able to surface enough positive deviations for each of these experiments and build a greater and greater coalition of voices that are really pushing for delivery systems to be much more effective, drawing more attention from philanthropy and other partners to actually fixing those issues and not just thinking that designing evidence-based informed policy is enough. It's necessary but not sufficient. We also need to think about implementation, and that's the black box, that the uncomfortable truth that we don't really touch upon very often, and as often as well as we should. So I think it would require a lot more coalition building and change management to really get to move in a serious way on the standards of performance of the public sector and the aid institutions.
Great, thanks, Avnish. Would you like to give us your thoughts in 1 minute, Ruth? Anything you want to add to that?
Honestly, on that point, Avnish, I think it was a mic drop moment for Avnish. He covered the waterfront. Let me just say one word about the gaming question, because I'm not sure if anybody picked up on that and whether this kind of arrangement induces a kind of gaming of outcomes. And there I would say that's why you have to really be careful about what outcomes you choose and have them be the truly meaningful ones, as in this case, meaningful in terms of increases in income/consumption and assets. So the gaming can occur when the outcomes that are chosen are actually not necessarily related to the true impact that you want to have. So the closer you can get to measuring and paying on the true impact that you wish, then the less you have to worry about the gaming problem.
Great, thank you so much. Yeah, that's a really important question. Thanks for picking up on that one. All right, well, we're going to move to our fireside chat. Please join me all in thanking our panelists for this fantastic conversation. Welcome, John.
Hi there.
Great to see you. So for our fireside chat, we now have John MacArthur, who is a senior fellow and director of the Center for Sustainable Development here at Brookings. And before joining Brookings, John was Chief Executive Officer at the Millennium Promise Alliance. And prior to that, he served as manager and then deputy director of the UN Millennium Project. He's also been senior fellow with the Fung Global Institute, a faculty member at Columbia's School of International and Public Affairs, and policy director at Columbia University's Earth Institute. Can you hear me without this, or am I? No, yeah. All right. I will stick with the mic. All right, John. So great to see you. It's been a while. So John, you wear many hats in your different roles, and Most relevantly, you co-founded and co-chair the 17 Rooms Initiative, which is a new approach to catalyzing action for the Sustainable Development Goals. And in addition to that, you are senior advisor for the UN Foundation. So as we've heard today, the Village Enterprise DIB has focused on SDG 1, ending poverty, as well as SDG 8, the promotion of sustained, inclusive, and sustainable economic growth, full and productive employment, and decent work for all. The project, of course, indirectly touches on many of the other SDGs. So from your perspective, what are some of the key weaknesses of the current development finance architecture in addressing these goals? We've talked about some of them today in the conversation. And how do you see an initiative like the Village Enterprise DIB contributing to these challenges?
Well, thank you. I feel like I'm an underwhelming Fireside Chat after such a terrific panel. It was really great to hear from everyone. But I think the simplest answer to your question is that the development financing system is not trying to achieve the goals. So it's a pretty fundamental mismatch. And a lot of people who learn about the goals, whether it's especially in the private sector, but also in other walks of life, kind of presume that there's some budget that goes along with these goals that all countries of the world agreed to. But of course, there's not. And there's no real set of mechanisms to match the broad range of economic, social, and environmental problems. And I think, especially coming out of the pandemic and the crisis that it's been instigating, there's a broad awareness that the development financing system is a bit broken. And it's broken in particular because it's not getting anywhere near the amount of resources needed to match the goals that everyone requires. It's not providing the liquidity that the lowest income countries in particular and some of the lower middle income countries need. It's working very, very well for the richest countries that can borrow pretty much as they want in order to tackle any kind of unprecedented challenges at home. But even there, it's not providing quite enough systemic alignment with long-term outcomes like decarbonization, where public goods need a different set of incentives. So I think that's the kind of overview of everything. It's not that nothing's happening, to be very clear. There are things happening. Global official development assistance is about $170 billion a year in the latest accounting from the OECD. That is about cross-border flows, generally from richer countries to poorer countries. That's only a smidgen of the broad global sustainable development finance that's needed, which is on the order of probably 10 to 20 trillion a year in $100 trillion global economy. But there are things happening, and we do see in specific sectors and specific targeted forms of institution and I would say specific targeted forms of financing, some things are working. So it's not to be entirely maudlin about the whole thing, but it is to say that there's not enough of the good, and it's certainly not enough of the good to match the problems and the ambitions that everyone's agreed to.
Absolutely. Thanks for a little bit of good news there. So, John, you recently co-authored an essay in a series on 21st century multilateralism, which aims to address some of the most pressing questions and needs for international cooperation in the years ahead. Your essay was titled "From Vertical Funds to Purpose-Driven Funds: A New Approach to Multilateralism." So can you explain your key messages in this essay? I thought it was a great essay. And, what is the problem that you're attempting to address in this essay, and some thoughts on how it relates to today's discussion?
Well, I would say that when we look at, and it's part of why today's conversation is interesting, when we look at specific things where there are questions as to what works or questions as to how to scale up what works, we have both types of problems. So even I would say, we have we have pretty good evidence that vaccines work. in a pandemic. The ACT Accelerator, the international body for pooling resources, has a budget for the current fiscal year of about 17 billion, and it's got about 2 billion financed so far. So it's about a $15 billion gap. It's a pretty massive gap, and it just shows how even when the evidence is absolutely clear about what works, the world is still having trouble cooperating to put resources towards what works. There's a different set of questions, though, or a complementary when we're not totally sure what will work, or in the past, we haven't been entirely sure what will work, but there's a growing body of evidence, like today, about what types of things work. And the issues of extreme poverty are a pretty headline ambition for the world, at least nominally, where the first among equals of the Sustainable Development Goals literally target 1.1 is to end extreme poverty by 2030. And crucially, there is something called the 2015 Addis Ababa Action Agenda, which was the agreement of principles, at least, for financing for the Sustainable Development Global Agenda of policies. And in that, there was a very important commitment to get universal access to basic services, the idea of a new social compact, social protection and minimum essential services for all, which is utterly consistent with SDG 1.1 and extreme poverty by 2030. If we look at the institution which has taken on the lead ambition for this goal, it's actually the World Bank. In 2013, the World Bank took on the headline goal for itself of ending extreme poverty by 2030. There are a bunch of technical issues in terms of how the definition is counted, but the core of our argument with Homie Cross and Dennis Snower is that the institution of the World Bank, including IDA, the most grant-based financing arm, is not yet squaring the circle of this ambition of the goals, this institutional purpose that the bank has set for itself, and the financing mechanisms that need to be implemented around what we know works. And I would say that we estimate that the current global financing gap for extreme poverty is less than $100 billion. There are about 49 countries where it's more than 1% of national income. Therefore, they need a little bit of external help. And the body of evidence that's growing around what I would call an anchoring of cash transfers. And we heard today about cash transfers plus, and there's lots of debates on what's the right structure and what's the right plus. But there's a huge set of a body of evidence that cash transfers are an extremely powerful tool to get people out of extreme poverty, especially if we don't know what else to do. And so it's not to say that it's the only thing that needs to be done, but it's at least a very particular form of social protection, which is in the agreements. And an institutional vehicle could be created around that purpose of delivering social protection to everyone in the world who needs it, at least to end extreme poverty. So there's a long history of so-called vertical funds, which get all sorts of allergies in the room very quickly because people don't want more institutions. But we're saying, no, don't talk about vertical versus horizontal. Talk about purpose, talk about evidence, and talk about scaling mechanisms towards the evidence of what works.
Okay, great, thanks. So I sort of see these, or when I hear you, when I read your article.
Oh, I can't hear you right now for some reason.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, yes, thanks.
Great, okay, perfect. When I read your article about these purpose-driven funds, it really made me think about outcomes funds, which are the pooling of outcome funding for these outcomes-based financing mechanisms. So that's a trend that we're seeing increasingly, a number of outcomes funds in development for specific sector areas. So, for example, in education, the Education Outcomes Fund. So I'm wondering, just quickly, do you have any thoughts about kind of what might be some recommendations for these outcomes funds in terms of lessons learned, I think, from the, bad name, vertical funds, in terms of this, this purpose-driven focus?
I think one of the central elements is you need adequacy of finance for sure. That, to match the scale, I think a point that's already been made of the problem. But the governance of them is crucial too. So this goes well beyond intergovernmental governance. And one of my favorite institutions in the world, the Global Fund to Fight HIV Malaria, for example, has multi-stakeholder governance in from the start. It's got scientific review in the process of grant allocation, and it's got beneficiaries in effect represented in the governance mechanism on all sides. It's got civil society from different parts of the world, private sector, philanthropic representation, and science. That gives a ballast around the what works questions, which allow the scaling to update the systems to deliver results. I think if we're going to talk about large-scale international institutional reform, it needs to be anchored in similar principles of governance with the evidence on the board and in the process and the representation of the beneficiaries on the board, not through their government, but through the civil society, and working alongside the public sector entities that are crucial with the budget to match.
Absolutely. That kind of brings me back to our, at the start of this, I often, we talk about outcomes-based financing as being partnerships for public purpose. And I see this, this partnership of bringing in a diversity of stakeholders, really with the outcomes focus, at the core of this. Well, I wish we had more time to talk, John. It's been great to sit here with you virtually, and wonderful to have you. Will you all please join me in thanking John for this fantastic fireside chat? And
thank you.
And thanks again to all of the panelists, and also thanks to the Brookings team, in particular Sarah Osborne, Senior Research Analyst on my team, who's my partner in crime and behind all of our work on outcomes-based financing and other things. Thanks again to Brahima and to Hanan for your contribution at the beginning. Thank you all for joining us. Hope to see you again. Those of you who are joining us online, hope to see you in person sometime soon. Please take good care, and see you soon.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.